Hello, Mark.
Hi, Gabby.
So anything you can do, we can do better. Is that the NBA's response to us saying that British basketball was in chaos last week? I mean, it's an unbelievable story, and I'm so glad we're going to get a chance to delve a bit deeper into it today.
So it's all to do with betting and the Mafia and threats and games being thrown. So we'll look at it from both a basketball point of view and the Mafia point of view. We haven't got one of the Mafia on. We're just
Sadly.
using one.
I'm not sure
You'd
how
have
hard
loved
our
that.
team tried. I mean, I'm looking
You'd
at them
have
through
loved
the
that.
glass, and I would have loved it. We could have turned the
Andy-
spotlight off over there.
Andy Hughes, host of the Crime Agents, will give the. Well, I was going to say we'll give the Mafia perspective, but we'll give the crime perspective.
There's only really kind of one football story in town today, and I think that is the resignation of Brendan Rodgers, his second time, of course, as Celtic manager. I found this. I was quite shocked last night when this story dropped. Actually, I know you spent a lot of time with Chris Sutton, so maybe you had some inside track on this.
No, not really. I mean, to be fair to Chris, he wrote an article over the weekend saying that maybe Brendan Rodgers is just fed up of everything and close to walking out. So he did that over the weekend. And you could sense from everything that Brendan Rodgers has said over the last few weeks how frustrated he was and probably still is. You know, talking about, being manager of Celtic is like being given the keys to a Honda Civic, which did not go down well by all accounts with the players. I mean, we saw the Russell Martin sacked at Rangers critical of his players in post-match interviews, but he was a little bit more direct in what he said. Whereas, I mean, that's still criticism from Brendan Rodgers of his squad.
Yeah, I covered their failed attempt to get through to the Champions League proper through the knockout routes against Karabakh, and they were so poor, and it was clear then that they just hadn't invested properly the money that they'd earned last season from their really good run in the Champions League. Actually, they came within minutes of forcing extra time at Bayern Munich in the round in the first the qualification for the round of 16.
Yes.
the new format still gets me, and obviously got themselves out of that first league phase. And that, I think, is what has frustrated the fans and clearly has frustrated Brendan Rodgers as well. But this is refuted, of course, by Dermot Desmond, who in his statement was not holding back, should I say, was pulling no punches at all.
It is a gobsmacking statement for a couple of reasons, I think. Firstly, Dermot Desmond very rarely speaks publicly or puts statements out. That's one thing I've gleaned over the last 24 hours. Secondly, normally, when people leave or resign, there are sort of platitudes either way, and that's the end of it. Isn't that the case?
Yeah. Yeah.
And Celtic's club statement was quite, mundane and as you would expect after a manager goes. Dermot Desmond, regrettably, and this is about Brendan Rodgers, his words and actions have been divisive, misleading, and self-serving. They have contributed to a toxic atmosphere around the club and fueled hostility towards members of the executive team and the board. Some of the abuse directed at them and at their families has been entirely unwarranted and unacceptable. What has failed recently was not due to our structure or model, but to one individual's desire for self-preservation at the expense of others.
I don't think I can remember hearing something quite as eviscerating,
No.
for an outgoing manager, whatever the circumstances have been. And normally those things leak out, don't they, through kind of tittle-tattle at some point. But that is, it's extraordinary. And you've got also Hearts, obviously, top of the league. You've got Rangers, obviously, starting another new era, having with Danny Roll, having obviously given Russell Martin a go for the early part of the season. They must be feeling like, oh, thank God, they've taken the heat off us now.
Well, yeah, and I mean there are two things as well there. One, all this criticism, and Rangers recruitment has been hammered as well. So Rangers Celtics recruitment has been hammered. Hearts are top. They're 8 points clear. They've had investment from Tony Bloom at Brighton, but they've also had access to his data and analytics company. Mm-hmm. So they have got a bit of a head start on recruitment, you could argue, now over Celtic and Rangers. And how well Brighton recruit, and actually his team in Belgium, USG, who won the league. So they know what they're doing with data and recruitment. So Hearts are ahead of Celtic and Rangers, you would think, in that sense. And then the other thing, Celtic and Rangers meet this weekend in the League Cup semi-final. And what an opportunity for Danny Roll at Rangers to completely turn the mood around.
Or for Ange Postecoglou to take over again for the second time.
I think Martin might still be in charge. I mean, that Martin is in there, as I suppose, Martin O'Neill in interim charge along with Sean Maloney, just
to steady the ship and
steady the ship and try and keep the fans on side a little.
Yeah. Remember to hit subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you're listening. Get in touch, the sports agents at global.com, on email, messages on social media, or via the link in the episode description.
After this short break, Gabby can't wait to talk Mafia as we get into the gambling scandal that has rocked American sport.
Well, to talk about this, we have Mike Vorkunov, who is NBA business reporter for The Athletic, and Andy Hughes, who's host of the Crime Agents podcast and is crime correspondent at LBC. Let's come to you first, Mike, and just give us, if you can, a distilled version of what happened over the weekend and how much you knew of this actually coming down the track.
Well, I'll start with the distilled version. Last week, the FBI, Department of Justice, arrested more than 30 people across two different indictments. They arrested folks for two different things: for a sports gambling ring, and for what they said was a rigged poker game ring with some overlap between the two. And in the sports gambling operation, they either got one NBA player to allegedly take himself out of a game early so that people could make money on his bets, or they had people sell information to a number of sports gamblers so they could then, make money on knowing that a certain player would be out or might not be playing as much money. And in the second part of it, the rigged poker game ring, they use former professional athletes like Chauncey Billups, according to the government, to lure in people who would be victims, who would lose money in this, these poker games. And according to the DOJ indictment, they worked with the Mafia to operate these games in New York City, and the Mafia and other people would then be the heavies, right? Come in and enforce these debts or enforce the people who weren't paying. And there's some overlap between the two things, and there was it was quite a day here in New York City.
It's very important to talk about the difference between match fixing and spot fixing and the different markets that are available. So can I bet on the first 3-pointer scored by Miami Heat coming in the first 30 seconds of a game? Or is the market bigger than that?
Well,
less specific?
Yeah, here so far, it's still a bit of an emerging sports gambling market. It's only been legal in most of the country since 2018. And so the bets that you can do are things like, obviously, who can win a game, lose the game. But there's also what they call prop bets, which is, say for Terry Rozier, right, who was the Miami Heat guard who was arrested last week. It's will he score more or less points than this number, right? On rebounds, assists, 3-pointers made, right? Those types of things that are individual to that player. And then there are emerging bets, live betting, which is the type of stuff that you're talking about, which is who will be the first to 15 points, who will be the first to hit a 3, like those types of things. But those are not yet as prevalent here.
So therefore, if I was betting on an individual to score more than 30 points in a game, but they took themselves out of the game in the first quarter, these are the kind of things that are being looked at.
Yeah, so what they say Terry Rozier did was take himself out of a game early so that the people that he supposedly was working with could win the prop bets on him, that they bet the under on him scoring, I don't know, let's say it's 10 points, and that he took himself out before he could. And it's very eerily familiar to what another former NBA player, Jonte Porter, was arrested, charged, and pled guilty to doing in 2024, which is some of the same people worked with him where he came out of a game early so they could win on his rebounds, points, and assists prop bets, and sometimes even parlay all three of them together to win a huge bet.
Can we just talk about the history that you just alluded to it there? It's actually really young, if you like, really new, the idea that you can bet on sport, in a mass way across the US, because it was confined to pockets and areas, Vegas obviously being one of those, Atlantic City, where you could previously bet on sport. So when the rules changed, knowing that there could be potential kind of avenues of corruption and ways this could be infiltrated by the likes of those mafia families. They had an opportunity, presumably, to kind of lay this out in a way that not necessarily was going to be kind of, bulletproof, but was going to be safer than if it had just been allowed to develop organically. So in terms of, the kind of how the sports and how the governance worked, give us an indication of what the rules were.
Sure, yeah. Before 2018, sports gambling was legal in the United States, basically in 4 states, but really it was Las Vegas, right? Like everyone went to Las Vegas if you wanted to bet on games. Atlantic City and New Jersey as well. And those are the 2 big hotspots. And then the Supreme Court overturned a law that prevented that going to other states. And now we have legalized sports gambling, I believe, in 39 states, roughly, give or take, maybe off by a state. And each state has its own rules, but really there's been very little actual regulation of it. Some of the leagues, the NBA included, have asked for federal regulation of sports gambling because every state has gotten to set its own rules. They take a different, let's say, tax rate on all the bets being placed, right? Like there's huge variance between the tax rates between the state of Illinois and the state of New York, let's say. And the sports books have been able to increasingly get into the market, set their own rules for this. The leagues have played along. They get to make a good amount of money from their relationship with the sports books. But in terms of regulation, there really isn't any. The federal government has not regulated sports betting. States, I would say, mostly have been hands off, aside from legalize it in their individual states and setting the tax rates. And so, you got a bunch of different bets being placed in different markets, and we see it now emerging in other too. I don't know if you guys have this in the UK, but there's now predictions markets coming up. So you can essentially bet on what will happen in the future in stuff outside of sports, which is akin to betting, but it's called predictions, and so it's legislated differently.
I mean, I have to say, Mike, from all the NFL stuff that I watch, I am astonished and listen to. I am astonished how much the odds and the over/under market and tips has come into coverage of the NFL. Certainly, if I compare it to how myself and Gabby, when we do our football over here, we don't talk odds, we don't talk over/unders, we don't, do we? I mean, it's not allowed. I mean, programs are sponsored by betting companies,
but not on the BBC, for example.
But not on the no.
But you might say which manager is the favourite to be appointed for, but you're not even giving the odds necessarily.
Are you surprised, Mike, by how interlinked gambling in US sport has become in such a short spell? And the follow-up to that is the NBA the most susceptible of the big 3 American sports to be corrupted?
Well, I will make sure I get to that second one, so don't let me forget. But I want to say I'm not surprised because there's money involved, right? Like the reason why, here, if you watch the NBA, there's throughout the game, I can't tell you how many different, sports gambling ads there are, right? Like, in games, you watch a game that's not a national televised game. It's like, hey, bet on player X will hit this many points. The sports gambling companies have come in as significant revenue drivers for the leagues, for the teams, for media companies. And so when they come in and they advertise with them, that means that we'll then see it on our TVs. The NFL has a lot of sports betting ads, or, even during the halftime show or pregame show, right? They'll talk about, hey, what's your bet of the week or whatever, all these things. They're getting paid to do it. There's a strong financial incentive to do it. And so if you watch a game, you are like inundated with sports gambling ads. It's impossible to miss. And it's clear that they're trying to push people into gambling, whether they want to admit it or not. And so with no regulation in place, the UK, I've tried to follow it a little bit. You guys are, I'd say, a few decades ahead of America. And it seems like at some point you reach an inflection point where you said, maybe we need to regulate this a little bit more. Maybe we need to take a step back. We need to take gambling ads off the front of soccer jerseys, right? The US has not gotten to that point yet. So it's at some point, maybe we'll see that happen. But for now, it's advertised at pretty much anywhere and everywhere. I'm walking down the street here. There's parlay ads, like FanDuel is saying, place a parlay with us when I take the light rail from one city to another.
And is basketball more susceptible than the other two, than baseball and NFL?
It's susceptible in the way that one person can affect a game more easily in basketball than say football or baseball. I think maybe baseball is pretty susceptible to, I don't know if you guys saw, but this summer there was a gambling scandal in Major League Baseball where a pitcher was accused of essentially like, the first pitch of an inning you can bet on, and if it's a ball or a strike. And so allegedly he seemed to have, implicated, impacted that, right, as part of a bet. And so baseball, because it's an individualized event type of sport, you can have that effect there too. So I guess it's basically which one do you want to get into first?
Yeah. Andy, can we bring you in? Because the intersection of sport and this kind of crime, gambling, betting, and pulling in key players into those, crime syndicates is not new. Cricket particularly has had its big high-profile moments, but other sports too.
Yeah, I mean, since betting was invented, organised crime has had their fingers in it. I mean, this goes back to the early 1900s. And it was really in the 50s that the New York crime families got really involved, and we're still seeing it now, of course. And it was John Gotti, the infamous mob boss. He kind of made his name in sports betting, illegal sports betting, and he became the biggest gangster in the world. Recently, the most high-profile ones, the Hansi Cronje scandal. He was the South African cricket captain. And he was approached by a member of an organised crime group, and he was given money to throw matches. And what he did was he picked on young, vulnerable players in that team, which is a common theme. And then later, this again happened 10 years later in the Pakistan team, when three of their players deliberately bowled no balls.
And that I watched a brilliant documentary. I don't know if you've seen it on that, and it's so linked to the bigger kind of markets that was in Asia. Those markets were, and the big crime kind of syndicates there. How vulnerable, from your experience of looking into this kind of thing, how vulnerable are players when you read the kind of salaries of some of the players who've been sucked into this on $26 million a year? What's going on? Why would you be kind of swayed and potentially throw your whole career away? What kind of sums are they being lured in with?
If you're involved in organised crime, their main tactic is intimidation and exploitation. They will see highly paid sports stars who frankly don't know a lot about the real world as easy prey. And this has been happening, again, since the 50s and 60s, where boxers were throwing matches. And then even in the 80s, the FBI looked into what was happening in the NBA because they knew that the 5 Mafia families were trying to infiltrate it. So this is a common tactic that we see time and time again. These organised, intimidating criminals going after, they see vulnerable people with lots of money and maybe not much sense.
And also, I mean, you talk about the intimidation. I mean, you go to the Pakistani spot fixing, and the players involved there. Mohammed Amir was 18 when he got embroiled in that. And you talk about intimidation. It's threats. It's threats to family back on the subcontinent, isn't it? It's you don't do this, we will hurt people you love. That's how that happened. It tends to be more intimidation than financial.
Oh yeah, totally. And what they will do is they will get in touch with the families of these players or associates of these players. They will find out who they are, and then they make threats to their family, and that to them, then they're entrapped. And this is what happened with the Pakistani scandal. And as you say, he was 18 years old and he went to jail for that, and he was banned for 4 or 5 years. So, I mean, he managed to actually come back and salvage some sense of his career, but that's very rare.
30 indicted, players, coaches, other figures. What does that actually mean? How does this process work?
Well, the tricky thing about this, the FBI and the gambling companies, it would be easy for them to identify these trends, these niche bets that are losing loads of money. Then, therefore, you look into that. What's tricky for the FBI is, are these participants willing or unwilling? Are they being exploited? And that is much harder to get their heads around because, again, these organised criminals will be leaning on these people involved, saying, if you talk about us, if you tell us, then we're going to hurt your family. So people who may be unwilling in this, they may having to be going through this whole procedure because they're scared.
Mike, do you as a journalist involved in this, have, bearing in mind what we've just talked about, have sympathy for some of those involved?
Yeah, I think if you've gotten into a place where you're fearing for your life or fearing for the safety of your family, I certainly understand why you might act and do what you did. I guess to me the question has always been, how did they get involved in the first place?
Yeah.
We know some
Yeah.
outlines of the alleged scheme, right? We don't know the origination point. We don't know how and who it all started it, and so that point is important to me. But you take like Jonte Porter, like, I think his case is what we might know a good amount about so far. He ran up gambling debts, and in some of the texts that the federal government had and shared, he mentioned that he was being threatened for it, right? And so this is an NBA player who was put in that position, and so it's you have to figure out, how did you run up the gambling debts, and then what were the threats? But you certainly have sympathy for anyone. Sometimes they're being threatened.
I did a Hansi. I may have mentioned this before, Gabby. I can't remember. I did a Hansi Cronje documentary 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, and I met the bookmaker in a hotel room in London. I mean, me and my producer, before we went into that room, were slightly nervous before we went in there, but we met the bookmaker involved with Hansi Cronje, and he took me through so many different games that he was either involved in influencing or assumed would have been influenced. And one of the reasons why he could influence it was because of the nature of what you could bet on at the time. How many runs a team would score after 10 overs, over under. How many runs a team would score in 15 overs. And a bit like what Mike said there, Andy, if you have a market on whether the first pitch of a baseball game is going to be a ball or a strike, you're an idiot. Because you are only because it's easily manipulated if you want it to be. So is the onus, and cricket and bookmakers and cricket did change the markets that could be bet on. Is it simply, don't make your markets so specific?
I actually think I spoke to a detective about this, and he says the way the betting system is certainly set up in this country, and how niche you can make these bets, it's actually designed to be exploited. It's designed to actually be corrupt, because why else would you bet on someone who's going to take a corner in the 8th minute of a game or something like that, other than you know more than you should?
I was just thinking there about, and Mark and I, will have experienced this kind of at the same time through the kind of progression of our sports that we cover and careers that we've had, the number of stats that become available to us all the time, whether it's in rugby, it's kind of meters made after dominant tackles, that kind of thing. That wasn't a thing when I first started covering rugby. No. It was a thing in terms of the eyes. You could see players were doing that. There's so much more to bet on if you look at a kind of the huge range of stats that are delivered throughout a game. So anything in the underworld, if you like, in the kind of exactly. like below the legal betting markets can happen, can't it? And that is something that I imagine is almost impossible to police, isn't it?
Well, exactly. I mean, it just provides opportunities, doesn't it? It provides opportunities for these schemes to happen. It's making it very easy for criminals to do what they're doing.
What's the damage there, Mike, at the moment? Is there a sense at the moment of basketball fans in particular thinking, I don't believe half the stuff that's going on at the moment now? The new season's just got underway.
I think they were thinking that even before all this, and not to be glib, but like, listen, I think NBA fans are perhaps the most conspiratorial of all fan bases. You guys might disagree with me, but there's always a bit of conspiratorial lore involved with the NBA in certain parts. And so whenever you have almost objective verification of your own conspiracies, right? Like in here, it's in the small cases, Terry Rozier taking himself out of a game that didn't matter, or Jonte Porter impacting 2 games. It just allows you to build on that. And so, look, I think it will make fans more wary, even if you're not able to find any evidence of a larger scheme, which we haven't seen to this part. And also, like, reputationally for the league, maybe it's it just happened to them instead of baseball or football down the line, but still they're the first league that's genuinely impacted by sports gambling on such a large scale when you have, FBI arrests, poker rings, all in the same headline involving your league. So it's a big
not
deal.
It's not what the more wholesome brands want to be associated with, is it? So if you crack down on the advertising of gambling around the sport, as has happened over here, as you alluded to, then you start to kind of eke out those legitimate kind of partners, don't you? It's something which I'm sure they're going to go through a process of kind of discovery, because at the moment it feels and smells like crisis management.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is. And they're already kind of, starting a little bit, maybe trying to control the path through which injuries are reported, right? Like we saw that was something that was exploited, who might not play in the game. I think there's a limit to it, because ultimately, can you really control everyone who finds something out, who's around the team, right? Like you can't just ban players from having friends and family and not finding out information. It's impossible, right? Like that's not even the NBA's fault. That just is. And so you have to have a tight...
You say that, right? But a friend of mine recently was involved in a major merger of two companies. Had he told us and we put money on one of those companies, he would be implicated. We could be implicated. Yeah. And for that reason, he did not tell us. We did not press him to do that. Yeah. Now, obviously, that's because I would like to think we've got good moral compasses, right? But because the fallout for him, as somebody who is, leading a major stock market merger, would be criminal, would be huge. So that incentive surely would be enough for people to not relay information. I'm not talking about sharing with your auntie that you've got a bad knee, but there is to not be relaying that information. And also, but sports fans are notoriously secretive, aren't they? Footballers whisper to each other on the pitch. They don't let the team out. A football team doesn't go out until an hour before kickoff, for goodness sake.
But weirdly, Gabby, I mean, without bringing it back to us, which I know we like to do, there was a market for Match of the Day presenter.
True.
Good point, well made.
There wasn't there? And I mean, I didn't talk.
And I said they'll never give it to Davina McCall.
but even strictly at the moment, it can be. I suppose, Andy, it can be quite hard to. I'm winding it out a bit from Mafia and the NBA, but because I don't think me and Gabby are linked to the Mafia, but it could be, not to my knowledge. But it must be quite difficult to prove. If you run, again, I go back to if you run a book on it, then you're a bit vulnerable, aren't you?
Well, it's basically, there's a name for it, or everything you're talking about. It's insider trading, and if you know what's going to happen, then how are you going to prove? How are you basically going to prove that someone knew that there was going to be an injury in the 8th minute, unless someone actually admits it? How are you going to actually prove it? Just by the stats? Just by looking at the amount of money that was made? If everyone denies it, I mean, it's going to be pretty difficult legally to actually get over the line.
And sorry, the other thing that we're doing here, we're talking about sort of above board bookmakers and books and gambling. There will always be the under the table gambling, which still leaves athletes susceptible. And that was one of the big things with cricket, obviously, back in the day, was because there was no official betting market in India, for example.
The one thing as well about this that has really struck me, as somebody whose favourite film is Goodfellas, is just how kind of unsophisticated the development of the mafia money-making machine is, in the sense that, to my mind, I would have thought they were well into kind of cybercrime by now, right? I would have thought they'd have moved away from kind of X-ray glasses on a poker table and things that are kind of can be, kind of, where you'd think quite easily kind of found out above board. They're almost in plain sight, aren't they, these crimes?
Well, yeah, I mean, they kind of always have been. They're old school. And betting has always been a staple for them. And the reason they got involved, it was just a steady stream of income for them. And it was actually relatively low risk because it was way, way less risky than drug trafficking or extortion or anything like that. So they've always seen this as just, listen, we're not going to make easy money. I mean, even back in the 70s, John Gotti was making 15 million quid a year, and he was saying that's just a little steady earner for me. So that kind of tells you how big their enterprise is.
So they use the big name coaches and players often as kind of big fishes to lure in and get people to come and play in a game because they want to play with a celebrity effectively.
Exactly.
So they're not even asking them within that game necessarily to do very much. The table and the other tricks they've got around it will do that.
Yeah, exactly. And I assume the agents and the entourage of these players, because they've all got big entourages now, I'm assuming they will be getting dragged into this. And because how else would you get to them, these managers or these coaches? And once they've got their claws in, once the organised criminals, when people like the Gambino family in New York are getting their claws into you, it is
well, if your
very
agent's
hard
worth
to
their
get out of
salt,
that.
your agent's going, why are you going to Vegas on a Tuesday night on a private jet? What's going? So that it would feel, wouldn't it, Mark, that there's the bigger entourage, as we know with sports people. They don't act in silos, do they?
No. Is there any way, Mike, that this works out as a positive in the end? I mean, the NBA statement says this is an opportune time to carefully reassess how sports betting should be regulated and how sports leagues can best protect themselves, their players, and their fans. Is that the positive?
Well, if there's any tangible changes really made, right? If it does get to a point where they start regulating what bets can be taken, I think there's a twofold thing going on, which is the sportsbooks are always looking for an expansion of the bets that they can take, right? Which impacts people because they're just betting more and more frequently. And that's great for the books. It's probably bad for society as a whole to build a nation of sports bettors. And if anything actually happens, we'll see. But I haven't seen any interest from sportsbooks as of now, or even maybe even the leagues, to just limit, let's say even prop bets, right? That's the most exploitable one. You're betting on one person specifically to do or not do something. But I haven't seen any, in the feedback to this, that the sportsbooks are going to stop taking prop bets.
You've kind of touched on this in terms of, the historic nature of this. And, there are incidences and moments in the decades gone by where suspicious habits and betting have been looked at. But the conspiracy theorists are having a field day now, aren't they? And one of those doing the rounds is that potentially, why did Michael Jordan leave the league in '94 to play baseball? That's one that's been doing the rounds. Have you noticed any more unusual ones that have reared their head?
I haven't yet, but I mean, like, the NBA is just a history of conspiracies. Why did the Knicks win the NBA draft lottery in 1995? The Jordan one. Why did the Lakers beat the Kings in the 2002 Western Conference Finals? The NBA has had their gambling scandals before. Tim Donaghy, if you remember him, this just comes up all the time.
We did it earlier this year, didn't we? Who won the draft?
The Mavericks.
That seemed
That's right. Yeah.
And they're and that probability of them winning that draft was minuscule, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was roughly 1%, if I remember the odds correctly.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
Doncic.
Did he put a bet
and his
on?
move as well. We discussed that, Mark, didn't we? That was all to do with that, wasn't it? The trade to the Lakers. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Listen back to that episode of The Sports Agents to prove that we haven't just jumped on this story.
No, exactly. We've been across it all along. I also love in the midst of that, you sort of suggested to the Mafia that they could up their game a bit and be a bit more high-tech.
I mean, there's part of me that feels quite nostalgic for their old-fashioned ways. And the movie of this will, of course, be excellent.
Oh, it will be, yeah.
Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us. And of course, you can listen to The Crime Agents, which is another of the global podcasts fronted by Andy Hughes.
Okay, that's it for today. Make sure you subscribe or follow and leave a review, and you can catch up with all of our past episodes on YouTube, Global Player, or wherever you get your pods.
And you can always get in touch with us, the Sports Agents, at global.com, or message us on social media via the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.
The Sports Agents
with Gabby Logan and Mark Chapman.